The station Oreth 9 floated in neutral space like a silver crown above the darkness of the galaxy. It was the home of the Galactic Concord, the greatest alliance of species ever built by minds that had reached for the stars and found each other waiting there. The Concord had 214 member civilizations. It had courts and fleets and laws and languages beyond counting, and for 60 years it had included humanity, the strange, soft-spoken species from a blue world called Earth. Humans had always been different from the others. Not stronger, not older, not faster. They were not the most advanced species in the Concord. And they were not the most feared. They were something harder to explain. They were the ones who always showed up. When something went wrong, they brought food to dying worlds. They sat at the bedsides of alien refugees. They mediated wars between species who had hated each other for centuries. They gave and gave and gave, until other civilizations sometimes forgot that giving was a choice, not a limitation. The Galactic Concord loved humanity, the way a neighborhood loves a kind neighbor. They appreciated humans the way you appreciate something that has always been there and always been good. Nobody thought about what would happen if they broke it. The Vrethkai were an empire on the outer rim of the galaxy. They were tall and gray-skinned, with 4 arms and eyes like cold amber fire. They had been conquering their neighbors for 200 years before the Concord even knew their name. When they finally made contact with the Alliance, they had been careful, they had been polite, they played the long game, because they were intelligent enough to know that a direct attack on the Concord would destroy them before they were ready. So they watched, they probed, they tested borders, they took small things, a mining station here, a colony supply route there. And whenever the Concord raised its voice, the Vrethkai smiled and called it a misunderstanding. Humanity had proposed the summit. It was Director Yale Osai herself who drafted the proposal. She was a tall woman with dark skin and sharp eyes, and the kind of stillness about her that made people in meetings lean forward without realizing it. She had spent 30 years in galactic diplomacy. She believed, truly believed, that almost every conflict in the galaxy had a solution that did not require burning things down. She sent the proposal to Vrethkai High Command. She offered neutral ground. She offered full representation. She offered humanity's own diplomatic fleet as a gesture of goodwill, unarmed ships to escort Vrethkai delegates safely to the table. The Vrethkai accepted. They used the coordinates to find New Carthage. New Carthage was humanity's largest colony world. It sat in the Kepler system, 300 light-years from Earth. It had been built over 80 years by 4 generations of human families. It had universities and farms and hospitals and parks where children ran in the long light of a yellow sun. It had 4,200,000,000 people living on it. On the morning the Vrethkai fleet arrived in orbit, the bombardment lasted 6 hours. The Vrethkai did not target military installations. They targeted cities. They targeted water systems. They targeted the underground evacuation bunkers that people ran to. When the first strikes hit, the attack was not a military operation. It was a message written in fire across an entire world. The message was simple. You are not safe anywhere you never were. By the time the Concord's emergency channels lit up with the news, New Carthage was silent. The session in the Concord Assembly Chamber was held within hours. Ships were scrambled, ambassadors were woken in the middle of sleep cycles, and rushed to their seats. The chamber was enormous. A great circular room with hundreds of seats arranged in rising tiers around a central floor. The air hummed with dozens of alien languages being translated in real time. The mood was one of horror and guilt, and the very specific shame of people who knew they had let something happen that they should have seen coming. The Vrethkai ambassador was removed from the station. Immediately, he did not resist. He smiled as the security team escorted him out. And that smile was recorded by 17 different cameras and broadcast across the galaxy before the session even formally opened. Director Yale Osai sat in the human delegation seat on the central floor. She did not speak when the session opened. She did not speak when the Concord's senior facilitator expressed grief on behalf of all member civilizations. She did not speak when 3 different ambassadors rose to offer formal condolences. She sat very still in her chair with her hands flat on the table in front of her, and she looked at the center of the room the way someone looks at a thing they have already decided about. The facilitator, a tall insectoid being named Chorus 7, turned to the human delegation and asked gently if Director Osai wished to address the chamber. She looked up. She picked up her datapad from the table, she powered it off, she set it down. She pushed her chair back, she stood up, and she looked around the chamber slowly. Not with anger, not with tears, but with the kind of quiet that lives just below both of those things. She looked at every tier of seats. She looked at the faces of 214 civilizations, and she held that silence long enough that the translation systems actually flagged it as an anomaly. Then she walked out. No statement, no declaration, no ultimatum. She did not slam the door. She did not raise her voice. She simply left the chamber of the greatest diplomatic body in the galaxy mid-session, without a single word, and the door closed behind her with a soft and ordinary click. The chamber stayed silent for a very long time. Nobody had ever done that before. Ambassadors did not leave conquered sessions. Without speaking, there were procedures, there were protocols, emotions were expected and accommodated. There were grief counselors on staff for exactly these kinds of moments, but Yale Osa had not cried. She had not raged, she had simply looked at the room as though she had been asked a question, and had already found her answer somewhere before she arrived. Chorus 7 called a recess. In the corridors outside the chamber, the conquered senior staff moved quickly, trying to reach the human delegation, trying to understand what had just happened. Aides were dispatched, messages were sent on every frequency, humans monitored, none were answered. By the time night cycle began on Orith 9, the human quarter of the station was very quiet. The lights in the embassy offices were all on, but the doors were locked, and nobody came to answer when conquered staff knocked. An analyst named Breck Tolan from the Uvari delegation filed an internal report that night that was later pulled from the conquered archive and read by historians for a long time afterward. He wrote only one line in the summary section at the bottom of his report. He wrote, "I have studied war for 40 years, and I have never been as frightened as I was today watching a human woman walk quietly out of a room." Outside the station, the stars were cold and very far apart, and the galaxy that had been going about its business for billions of years continued to turn without any awareness of what had just been set into motion on a silver station in neutral space. Somewhere far away in the direction of the Kepler system, the ruins of New Carthage were still warm. And on a blue world 300 light-years from there, a species that had spent 60 years choosing patience over power sat in the dark with their grief, and made a decision that no committee would be called for, and no vote would be taken on, and no diplomatic language in any known tongue had a word for. They had been civilized for a very long time. They were done. The first thing the galaxy noticed was the silence. It came slowly at first, the way a tide pulls back before something large and fast comes to shore. Human embassies across conquered space began to go dark one by one, not destroyed, not attacked, just empty. The staff left without announcement, without filing departure notices, without leaving forwarding contacts. They cleaned their offices, they returned borrowed equipment, they powered down their systems, they locked their doors, and they left. The conquered sent inquiries, none were answered. The Uvari delegation sent a personal message to Director Osai. She had known their ambassador for 11 years, they had eaten dinner together. They had laughed together at conferences, none of that mattered. Now, the message was not returned. What unsettled the conquered most was how clean it all was. There was no anger in the departure, no broken furniture, no burned files, no dramatic speeches transmitted on open channels. Human diplomatic staff simply stopped being present in galactic space, as quietly and completely as a candle being cupped in a careful hand. On Earth itself there was no panic. People gathered in public spaces not to riot, but to remember. Memorial walls went up in every major city covered in photographs and messages, and the names of the dead from New Carthage, The names took a long time to read out loud, because there were so many of them in the capital city of the United Earth government. A reading was held that lasted 11 days without stopping, because people kept coming to take their turn at the microphone and say a name and step back. Children stood in the crowds and held lights and did not fully understand what they were mourning, but they understood that it was enormous. And when the memorials were done, something shifted in the human population that was not grief and was not rage, but was something underneath both of those. A cold, settled, total clarity about what was going to happen next. The United Earth government did not broadcast a declaration of war. There was no speech from a podium, no flag raised, no dramatic image for the history files. There was a single classified signal sent from the Luna Command Center to every human fleet in deep space. The signal was one word: Carthage. Luna Command sat inside the mountain range on the far side of Earth's moon. It had been built 60 years ago, during the early days of galactic contact. It was where humanity kept the things it hoped it would never need. In the deepest levels of that facility were servers that held a contingency plan that had been developed quietly over 4 decades by a rotating team of military strategists and xenopsychologists and engineers who had one job and one job only. Their job was to answer the question, what do we do if diplomacy truly fails? The plan was called Protocol Carthage. It was named for the ancient Earth city that had been completely destroyed by its enemies 2,000 years before humans ever looked at the stars and wondered about neighbors. It was named that on purpose. It was named that so that the people who worked on it would never forget what they were planning for. Protocol Carthage had never been activated, not once in 40 years, not during border skirmishes, not during the trade wars of the 2150s, not during the Vorath incident, when a conquered fleet accidentally destroyed a human science vessel and killed 200 researchers. Even then, even when the families of the dead demanded action, the plan sat in its servers untouched. Until now. Within 48 hours of the Carthage signal going out, human colony worlds that had been farming planets began converting their industrial capacity to military production. Civilian shipyards that had spent years building passenger liners and cargo haulers received new blueprints. They did not ask questions. They went to work. Storage facilities across a dozen systems opened their sealed doors, and inside were weapons and hull plating and drive components that had never been used. Manufactured quietly over decades and stored in the dark, waiting for a day that everyone hoped would never come. The reserve fleets came online in deep space, massive formations of ships that had been sitting in cold orbit around uninhabited moons with their systems in minimal power mode. Some of those ships had been waiting for 30 years. They powered up in long, quiet rows, and their running lights came on one after another like stars being switched on by a patient hand. And the soldiers came. They did not come because they were ordered. They came because of one word sent to their personal devices, not their military channels. Their personal ones, the kind of channel where your family sends you birthday messages and old friends check in on quiet evenings. Every veteran who had ever served in a human fleet received the same single-word message from Luna Command. Carthage. They reported within 24 hours, every single one of them. There were no exceptions. There were no requests for clarification. There were no negotiations about deployment terms. Old men and women who had retired to farms and small towns and quiet corners of colony worlds kissed their families and picked up their bags and got on the transport ships without being asked twice. A retired fleet admiral named Goro Tanaka was 73 years old when the message reached him. He had been growing fruit trees on a small colony in the Proxima system for 9 years. He read the word on his device. He sat with it for about 4 minutes. He kissed his husband on the forehead. He picked up a bag he had kept packed under his bed since the day he retired, and he walked to the transport station. His husband stood in the doorway and watched him go. He did not ask when Goro was coming back, because they both already knew that the answer to that question depended on something much larger than either of them. On the Vrethkai side of the border, their intelligence networks were watching all of this and trying to make sense of it. An intelligence officer named Vethkarn filed 17 reports in the first 2 weeks he was good at his job. One of the best analysts in the Vrethkai Imperial Service, he had studied humanity for 6 years. He had read everything his empire had collected about the species. He had sat through dozens of briefings, where Vrethkai commanders dismissed humans as a soft civilization good for resources and diplomacy, but not for war. Now he sat at his station and watched the data come in, and felt something cold moving through him that he did not have a proper name for. The humans were not mobilizing the way civilizations mobilize for war. He knew what that looked like. He had seen it 20 times with 20 different species. There was usually noise, there were speeches and broadcasts and dramatic gestures meant to rally the population and intimidate the enemy. There were threats, there were ultimatums. There was none of that. The humans were mobilizing the way a person cleans a house before company arrives, methodical, quiet, thorough. They were not performing for anyone. They were not broadcasting their preparations. They were not trying to scare the Vrethkai or impress the conquered. They were simply getting ready with the focused efficiency of a species that had decided something and did not need anyone else's opinion about it. Vethkarn wrote in his final report, "They are not angry, they are not afraid, they are not trying to prove anything to us or to themselves. This is the most dangerous thing I have ever observed. I recommend immediate strategic withdrawal from all border positions. I recommend opening every diplomatic channel available. I recommend whatever we have to offer, we offer it now before this becomes something we cannot stop." His report was reviewed by a senior commander named Grand Marshal Drethvo, who had won 14 military campaigns and had never lost a battle to any species in the galaxy. Drethvo read the report. He set it aside. He called Vethkarn into his office and told him that humans were builders, not fighters, and that the mobilization was almost certainly a political performance meant to satisfy the human population's grief. He told Vethkarn to go home and get some rest. Vethkarn went home. He did not rest. He sat at his window and looked out at the stars and thought about the human ambassador walking quietly out of that chamber and the way she had looked before she left. Not like a woman who was angry, not like a woman who was afraid, but like a woman who had already finished an argument in her own mind and was simply in the process of standing up. Somewhere in the dark between the stars, the human fleets were moving. They did not transmit their positions. They did not announce their headings. They did not hail border stations or file flight plans with conquered traffic control. They moved in total silence through deep space, like something very large and very certain heading in one direction. The Vrethkai Empire sat on its throne of 200 years of conquest and waited for the humans to say something. The humans had nothing left to say. The first outpost went dark on a Tuesday. Nobody in the Vrethkai border command noticed for almost 6 hours because the outpost was a small one. A sensor relay station on the edge of monitored space staffed by 30 soldiers and a small support crew. It had been dark before during solar events and equipment failures, so the duty officer marked it as a technical issue and sent a maintenance ping and went back to his other work. The maintenance ping did not come back. By the time the duty officer escalated the issue, 4 more stations had stopped responding, all of them along a clean line in space, as though something had moved from one to the next in steady, unhurried progression. The duty officer filed an emergency report, and within 2 hours, a full alert had been raised across the border command center. Commanders gathered around their displays and looked at the pattern of silent stations and tried to understand what they were seeing. There was no debris field, no distress signal, no explosion signature on any sensor reading. The stations had not been blown apart, they had simply stopped transmitting, completely and instantly, as though someone had reached out and switched them off. Grand Marshal Drethvo was woken from sleep and brought to the command room. He stood in front of the display in his uniform and studied the pattern and felt something move through his chest that he had not felt in 40 years of military command. He recognized it after a moment and was surprised by it. It was the particular discomfort of not understanding what you are looking at. He ordered a rapid response fleet to the last known position of the missing border patrol, a wing of 12 warships that had also gone silent 2 days ago and had been listed as a possible navigation error. He expected the fleet to find wreckage. He expected a debris field large enough to explain 12 warships. He expected something that his tactical mind could measure and categorize and respond to. The fleet arrived at the coordinates and found nothing. No wreckage, no bodies, no drive signatures, no residual heat bloom from weapons fire. The 12 ships were simply gone, removed from space so completely that the only evidence they had ever existed at this location was the last automated position report they had filed before the silence. And then the fleet sensors picked up a signal. It was a human probe, small, drifting, transmitting on a repeating loop in perfect Vrethkai dialect, not translated, not synthesized, but spoken by a human voice that had clearly learned the language and spoken it carefully and slowly, so that every word landed exactly right. The message said, "This is not a war's end in negotiations, this is a consequence." The fleet commander listened to it twice. He did not move for a long time. He thought about the word consequence. He thought about what it meant in his language and what it meant in the human language, and whether the distinction mattered. He decided it. Did not he transmitted the recording to Drethvo and waited for orders. Drethvo listened to the message, and then he did something that surprised his entire staff. He sat down. He sat down slowly in his commander's chair, the way very old or very tired people sit down, and he was quiet for almost a full minute. Then he started giving orders. The full mobilization of every available Vrethkai warship took 4 days. It was the largest fleet assembly in the history of the Empire. 840 warships pulled from garrison duty and patrol routes and defensive positions around the core worlds. They formed up in deep space in the broad flat battle formation that had won Drethvo his 14 campaigns. The formation was called the Iron Fan, and when it spread across space, it covered enough distance that the ships at the far ends could not see the ships at the other far ends with the naked eye. Drethvo stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Eternal Conquest, and looked at the tactical display that showed his 800 ships arranged in perfect order, and felt something return to him. The confidence of a man who has measured a problem and found that he has enough to solve it. He had faced larger civilizations than humanity. He had broken species that had been spacefaring for 1,000 years before his empire ever left the ground. He knew how organic beings reacted when faced with overwhelming force. They slowed, they questioned, they looked for exits, they tried to talk. He waited for the human fleet to appear on sensors. It appeared, and it was bigger than his. Not slightly bigger, not meaningfully bigger in the way that makes commanders recalculate and adjust, not the kind of larger that inspires concern and caution. The human fleet was larger in the way that a coastline is larger than a boat. A number of ships so far beyond what his intelligence had estimated existed that the first thing Drethvo did was ask his tactical officer if the sensors were malfunctioning. They were not malfunctioning. There were over 2,000 human warships, and they came out of dark space not in a single formation, but in multiple waves spread across a volume of space so large that his Iron Fan formation, the one that had never been flanked in 40 years, was already partially surrounded before the engagement had even begun. Drethvo had a moment, just one brief moment, of pure tactical clarity in which he understood everything that Vethkarn had tried to tell him, and everything that he had dismissed, and everything that humanity had been quietly doing for 40 years, while he and his empire had been watching the wrong things. Then the engagement began. The human fleet did not charge, it did not broadcast a battle cry, it did not do anything theatrical at all, it simply moved. with a coordination and speed and geometric precision that Drethvo had never seen from any species in his career. The 6 flanking vectors split and curved, and intersected in a battle pattern so complex that his tactical AI, the finest military computation system his empire produced, took 11 full seconds to begin modeling it. In those 11 seconds, the human ships hit 4 of his fleet's command vessels simultaneously. Not the biggest ships, not the most armed ships, but the 4 ships whose destruction would break the communications grid that held the Iron Fan formation together as a coordinated unit. When those 4 ships went silent, the Iron Fan stopped being a formation and became 800 individual ships trying to figure out what was happening, and the human fleet moved through the gaps with the calm efficiency of water moving through open ground. The battle lasted 2 hours and 19 minutes. When it was over, Drethvo sat on the bridge of his damaged flagship, surrounded by the emergency lighting and the sound of repair crews working in the corridors, and he looked at his tactical display, which now showed a very different picture than it had 2 hours ago. He had lost 412 ships. The humans had lost 31. He sent a request for terms through every channel available. He was a military man, he understood. When a fight was over, he waited for the human fleet command to respond with conditions, with demands for surrender, with prisoner protocols, with the list of concessions they would require to stop their advance. The response came 4 hours later. It was not from a fleet commander, it was a short automated message that had clearly been prepared before the battle began. It said, "Terms are not available at this stage. We are not here to negotiate your surrender. We are here to ensure that what happened to New Carthage cannot happen again by anyone from anywhere. For any reason, continue to resist or stand aside. The outcome is the same either way." Drethvo read the message 3 times. He was 70 years old. He had been a soldier his entire life. He understood war, he understood victory and defeat, and the negotiations that followed both. He understood the rules that civilizations followed when they fought each other. He did not understand this. He called for Vethkarn and was told that Vethkarn had requested reassignment to a non-combat post 2 weeks ago and had been transferred. Drethvo thought about the analyst's last report and about the word he had used, dangerous, and about how poorly Drethvo had understood what that word meant when a human was the thing being described. Outside in the dark, the human fleet regrouped and checked its systems and moved forward again. It was not in a hurry. It did not need to be. The Galactic Conquered watched in silence, and the silence was not comfortable. Every member civilization had a feed running. Some watched through long-range sensor networks. Some had observation ships positioned carefully at the edges of the engagement zones, far enough to be safe, close enough to see the feeds showed the same thing from every angle. The slow, patient, systematic movement of human fleets through Vrethkai space, installation by installation, fleet garrison by fleet garrison, weapons platform by weapons platform. It did not look like vengeance, it did not look like rage. Rage was loud and fast and wasteful, and eventually burned itself out. This was different. This looked like maintenance, the way a careful person goes through a house and fixes every broken thing one room at a time without drama and without rushing. The human fleets did not touch civilian populations. Not once. Not a single Vrethkai civilian transport was intercepted. Not a single colony world was bombarded. Not a single hospital or residential settlement was targeted when human ships moved into a system. They identified and isolated military assets, an infrastructure with a precision that other civilizations' militaries would have spent years training to achieve. The Vrethkai civilians were frightened. They were displaced in some cases when battles happened near populated areas, but they were not killed by human fire. This confused many conquered members more than the scale of the campaign did. A species willing to do this much damage, and yet careful enough to protect the innocent, was a species that was fully in control of itself, and that was in some ways harder to process than simple destruction would have been. A species running on rage, could be talked down, could run out of momentum, could be tired or grieved into stopping a species that was calm and deliberate and precise, could simply keep going for as long as it decided to keep going. The Conquered Assembly met in emergency session 3 times in the first month of the campaign. At the first session, 6 member civilizations moved to formally call for a ceasefire. They argued that humanity's response, while understandable given the horror of what had happened, was disproportionate and threatened the stability of the entire Outer Rim. They argued that the Conquered had authority over military action by member states. They argued that procedures existed for exactly this situation, and that those procedures needed to be followed. Nobody sent the resolution to the human delegation, because the human delegation was not present. At the second session, 4 more civilizations joined the ceasefire motion, and a formal diplomatic envoy was proposed. A team of respected Conquered mediators who would travel to the engagement zone and open communications with the Human Fleet Command and find a framework for ending the campaign. The proposal passed with a strong majority, and the mediator team was assembled, and a ship was prepared. The mediator team's ship was stopped at the edge of human-controlled space by a single automated beacon that broadcast on all standard Conquered channels. It said, "This is a restricted zone. No Conquered vessels are authorized to enter. Until operations are complete, your safety cannot be guaranteed. If you proceed, we ask that you respect this boundary." The mediator ship turned around. At the third session, the atmosphere in the chamber was different. 2 of the civilizations that had backed the ceasefire motion did not send their ambassadors. One sent a junior aide who sat in the back and took notes and did not speak. And then something happened that nobody had planned for or put on the agenda. A Conquered archivist named Prethsal stood up. Prethsal was a quiet person. She worked in the Conquered's Historical Records Division. She had been with the organization for 30 years. She was not a diplomat or a commander. She was the kind of person who knew where everything was written down. She stood up in a session. She had no formal standing to address, and she asked the facilitator, Chorus 7, for permission to share something with the assembly. Chorus 7 gave her the floor because the session had already gone off script, and because there was something in the archivist's manner that made it feel important. Prethsal connected her datapad to the chamber's display system and put 200 years of classified Vrethkai history on the screens for every civilization in the Conquered to see. The records were not fabricated. They had been compiled by human intelligence teams from Vrethkai archives, captured during the campaign's early operations. They showed everything the 38 species the Vrethkai had contacted before the Conquered, and then quietly exterminated. Not defeated in war, but systematically removed from the galaxy, so completely that the Conquered had never known they existed. The records showed how it was done, the methods, the timelines, the decision-making processes inside the Vrethkai government that treated the destruction of entire civilizations as a logistical problem to be managed. They showed the internal Vrethkai assessment of the Conquered itself, a document 40 years old that described the alliance as a temporary obstacle and described humanity specifically as the component most likely to prevent Vrethkai expansion if ever awakened, and therefore the component that needed to be neutralized first. The chamber was quiet for a long time after the display ended. The ambassador from the Uvari civilization, the one who had tried to contact Director Osai after New Carthage, sat with his hands folded on the desk in front of him and looked at the floor. He had eaten dinner with the Vrethkai delegate at this very station 14 months ago. He had shaken hands. He had laughed at a shared joke. He had filed a report afterward describing the Vrethkai as prickly but potentially workable. He did not speak for the rest of the session. The ceasefire motion was quietly withdrawn. Nobody made a formal announcement about it. It simply stopped being on the agenda. 3 days later, the civilization of the Hethmora, a small species from the Midrim that had been absorbed into the Vrethkai Empire 40 years ago and kept as a subject population, sent a message to the Conquered asking what support was available for civilizations seeking to re-establish independence. They had heard that the human fleets were nearby. They wanted to know if it was safe to raise their old flag again. Chorus 7 sent them a full support package before the end of the day. And then Director Yale Ose walked back into the Concord Assembly Chamber. She had been gone for 9 weeks. The chamber had been operating without her, without any human presence at all, and her appearance at the entrance doors caused a ripple of reaction that moved through the tiers of seats the way wind moves through tall grass. She walked to the human delegation table. She sat down. She looked exactly the same as she had looked the day she walked out. Same stillness, same careful eyes, same quality of attention that made the room feel like she was the only one in it who had already read the last page. Chorus 7 gave her the floor without being asked. She did not stand. She spoke from her chair. She put one object on the table in front of her. A small physical object, not a hologram, not a data file, a child's shoe recovered from the ruins of New Carthage. The shoe was white with a yellow pattern on the side, and one of its laces was partially untied. It had been cleaned of the ash it was found in, but that was all. It sat on the polished surface of the Concord's central table, and every camera in the chamber recorded it. Yale Osai spoke for 47 seconds. She said, "We tried your way for 60 years. We funded it. We bled for it. We restructured our economy twice to support it. We sat at this table through things that our people back home begged us to respond to differently. And we held the line because we believed in what this assembly was trying to build. You have our respect for what this assembly aspires to be, but understand something clearly. We are not the species we were 9 weeks ago. We will finish what we came to do, and when it is done, we will return to this table, but we will never again be the ones begging for a committee vote. While our people burn, we are still here. We are still members of this Concord. We still believe in what it can be. But we are not your peacekeepers anymore. We are your equals. Treat us that way." She stopped talking. She did not ask for questions. She did not wait for applause or condemnation. She reached out and picked up the child's shoe and held it in her hands and looked at it for a moment. And then she placed it carefully into the bag beside her chair, and she sat back and waited for the session to continue. Chorus 7, who had run Concord sessions for 22 years and had facilitated negotiations between species who hated each other with centuries of history behind them, said nothing for a long time. Then they said, "The Assembly recognizes the human delegation and notes its return." It was the most understated thing anyone had said in that chamber in living memory. And somehow it was exactly right. The Vrethkai Imperium did not fall in a single dramatic moment. It came apart the way old things come apart. Not with a crash, but with a slow separation of pieces that had always been held together by force rather than by choice. The military was gone first. The great fleets that had enforced Vrethkai dominance across 100 systems were reduced to scattered survivors running dark in deep space, with no command structure to return to, and no home base that still had functioning landing infrastructure. The border garrisons surrendered in groups, small ones first, then larger ones. The commanders who had been chosen for their loyalty to the imperial throne found that loyalty had a practical limit, and that limit was the moment when the humans showed up outside their station with a fleet that made the station look like a toy. Human forces accepted surrenders with a process that was fast and professional and completely devoid of theater prisoners, were cataloged weapons, were secured stations, were placed under provisional human administration, and the prisoners were fed and given medical attention, and informed clearly of their rights under the terms of the provisional occupation. No prisoners were mistreated. This was not an accident. It was policy written at the highest level of Luna Command, and the policy was enforced with the same thoroughness as every other aspect of Protocol Carthage. Some soldiers in the field found it hard to follow. Some looked at the Vrethkai prisoners and thought about New Carthage and felt something hot and dark move through them and had to breathe through it. They followed the policy, not because they had stopped feeling what they felt, but because humanity had decided long before the campaign began that There was a difference between justice and cruelty, and they were only interested in one of those things. Admiral Goro Tanaka, the old man who had come out of retirement from his fruit trees on the Proxima colony, was the senior commander present when the Vrethkai Grand Marshal Drethvo formally surrendered command of the remaining Imperial forces. Tanaka was 73 years old, and he accepted the surrender standing straight in his uniform with his hands behind his back, and he looked at Drethvo with eyes that had seen a great many things, and he said nothing beyond what the formal protocol required. When it was done, one of Tanaka's junior officers asked him afterward if it had felt like anything. This moment that would be in the history books from here to the edge of the galaxy. Tanaka was quiet for a moment, then he said, "It felt like lifting something very heavy and putting it down. I am glad it is over. I am not glad it happened. I do not know how those two things can both be true at the same time, but they are." The junior officer wrote that down and kept it. The Conquered took custody of the Vrethkai leadership for war crimes proceedings. The trial was long and careful, and conducted according to every standard the Alliance had developed over centuries of working out how civilizations were supposed to hold each other accountable. Humanity had insisted on this loudly, and clearly from the moment the campaign ended they had not traveled this far and done all of this to watch the people responsible disappear quietly. They wanted the Conquered to do its job, and they waited to see if it would. It did. The senior Vrethkai commanders received sentences that matched the scale of what they had ordered. The results were published and distributed to every corner of conquered space, and the name of New Carthage was spoken in the chamber by the prosecuting team on the final day of proceedings, and the number 4,200,000,000 was placed on the official record of the galaxy's legal history, so that it would be there forever. The subject populations of the Vrethkai Empire, 12 civilizations that had been conquered and controlled, and in some cases nearly destroyed over 2 centuries of imperial rule, were formally recognized as independent by the Conquered. The Hethmora raised their old flag. They were the first but not the last. Reconstruction of those worlds was going to take generations. Human engineers and agricultural specialists and medical teams were among the first support groups to arrive on the most damaged ones. They came because humanity sent them. They came because even now, after everything, the impulse to show up when something was broken and try to fix it had not gone anywhere. It had never been weakness, it had always been a choice. Back on Earth, the homecoming was quiet in the way that meaningful things are often. Quiet fleets returned to their home stations. Veterans came back to their families. The reserve soldiers who had left their farms and small towns and quiet lives went home again. Some of them were changed in ways they would spend years understanding. Some of them were entirely fine and were not sure how to feel about being entirely fine. The counselors were busy for a long time. New Carthage would not be rebuilt, not completely, not in any form that would pretend the original was still there. A decision was made at the highest level of the United Earth government that the world would be partially restored enough to sustain life, and that a portion of it would be preserved as it was. The ruins, the silence, the scorched outlines where cities had been. The memorial that was built there was not tall or elaborate. It was a long, flat wall of dark stone on the edge of what had once been the largest city on the planet. The stone was carved with names, every name that could be recovered. The names took up every centimeter of the wall, and the wall was very long on its base in every language known to the galaxy. A single line was carved. We extended our hand 1,000 times. Remember what happened when you burned it. On Orith 9, the Galactic Conquered was in the long, slow process of figuring out what it was now, because it was not the same thing it had been before New Carthage, and before the campaign, and before the Vrethkai archive had been opened and read by 200 civilizations who had to sit with the knowledge that they had been sharing a galaxy with something that monstrous for a very long time without knowing. The renegotiation of humanity's position in the Conquered took 8 months, not because it was complicated, but because the other parties needed time to arrive at the obvious conclusion at their own pace. The conclusion was this: humanity was not a junior member anymore. They were not the peacekeepers. They were not the ones who got called. When something needed soft handling and diplomatic patience, they were full equals with the same weight and the same vote, and the same standing as the oldest civilizations in the Alliance. Some members had trouble with this. Those members eventually accepted it. At a reception held after the renegotiation was formalized, Director Yale Osai stood near the edge of the room with a glass of something the Uvari had brought that was sweet and faintly blue, and she was talking to a young diplomat named Essa, who was from a species that had only joined the Conquered 2 years ago. A small civilization from a water world in the Midrim who were still learning how the galaxy worked. Essa had been watching humanity carefully since the campaign ended. The way her people watched humanity now was not the same as how the galaxy had watched humanity before New Carthage, before they had been seen as warm and generous and fundamentally safe. Now there was something else in how people looked at them. A careful quality, a respectful distance. The specific attention you give to something that has shown you exactly what it is capable of, and has chosen to come back to the table anyway. Essa asked Director Os what she thought humanity actually was. The galaxy had so many theories now, so many new assessments and strategic papers and philosophical discussions about the nature of humans and what they meant for the future of the Conquered. She asked what the truth was underneath all of it. Osai looked at her glass for a moment. She looked around the room at the reception in progress, at the dozens of species talking and trading small courtesies, and doing the endless patient work of being in a galaxy together, which was hard and required everyone to keep choosing it every day. She looked back at Essa and she smiled, and it was a real smile, tired and warm and entirely genuine. She said, "We are the species that still cried at the funerals, even theirs." She finished her drink, she set the glass down. She excused herself and walked back into the room, and Essa stood where she was and watched her go and thought about those words for a very long time. Outside the station, the galaxy turned. It had been doing that since before any of them existed, and it would keep doing it long after all of them were gone, but something had changed in the way the pieces of it related to each other. Something that would not go back to the way it was before, no matter how many sessions the Conquered held or how many diplomatic papers were filed. The galaxy was not the same place it had been the morning the Vrethkai fleet appeared over New Carthage. Neither was humanity. And both of those things were true, and neither one of them was going away, and the only real question left, the one that every civilization in the galaxy was quietly asking itself every day from that point forward, was whether you were the kind of neighbor who remembered the lesson, or the kind who needed to be reminded.